Queen Camilla has never needed to raise her voice. That's what makes her dangerous. While the world watches King Charles navigate his illness with quiet dignity, and while Harry and Meghan circle the question of a potential return to British soil from their Montecito fortress, one woman sits at the center of this entire calculation. And she isn't the one anyone expected. Camilla Parker Bowles, once the most despised woman in Britain, once the figure Diana supporters blamed for everything, has somehow emerged as the quiet gatekeeper of one of the most consequential decisions the House of Windsor will face in years. Whether Harry and Meghan return to the United Kingdom isn't simply a matter of scheduling or logistics or even the king's fragile health. It is, in the estimation of those who understand how this family actually operates, almost entirely a matter of whether Camilla allows it. That is not a small thing. That is a seismic shift in the architecture of royal power. There was a time not so long ago when Camilla was the outsider looking in. Tolerated by the institution, loathed by the public, accepted by Charles's sons only with great reluctance and visible discomfort. William, by most accounts, has long since made his peace with her. Harry, by his own published account in Spare, has not. The wounds he described are specific, personal, and on the record. He wrote about her leaking stories to rehabilitate her image at his expense. He described a stepmother who prioritized her own reputation over the well-being of the family she married into. He put her name to allegations that, in any other context, would have ended careers. She has not forgotten. People like Camilla never do. But the question of whether Harry and Meghan will ever set foot on royal ground again runs far deeper than a simple scheduling conflict. And the answer begins with a relationship that was never repaired. The story of Camilla and the Sussexes did not begin with a single argument or a single act of betrayal. It accumulated, slowly, then all at once, the way most royal disasters do. Go back to 2018. Meghan Markle arrives in the British royal family as someone the institution does not quite know what to do with. She is American, biracial, divorced, and utterly unwilling to disappear into the background. The courtiers who had spent decades managing the monarchy's image found her disorienting. And in that atmosphere of institutional unease, Camilla, who had spent years navigating her own tortured path from villain to accepted consort, was not the welcoming presence Harry might have hoped for. Sources close to the couple have consistently described a coldness, a deliberate withholding of the guidance and warmth that might have steadied Meghan during those early destabilizing months inside the firm. That coldness metastasized. By the time Harry and Meghan sat down with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, the fractures were structural. Meghan described crying before her wedding. She described suicidal thoughts met with institutional indifference. She described a palace apparatus so consumed with managing its own survival that the humanity of one woman inside it simply did not register. She did not name Camilla in that interview. She did not need to. The picture of the palace she painted was one in which Charles's wife was not a bystander. Then came Spare. Harry's memoir, published in January 2023, was not a careful diplomatic exercise. It was a detonation. He named Camilla explicitly. He described her as someone actively courting the press, briefing against him, trading on the currency of Sussex drama to brighten her own standing. He wrote that she was dangerous because she was calculating, that beneath the warm public persona existed a woman who understood power and was not shy about deploying it. Those are serious allegations. They appeared in a book that sold over 1.4 million copies on its first day of publication. They are, in the most literal sense, on the permanent record. Camilla has never publicly responded. That silence is not restraint, it is strategy. You do not dignify attacks that, with patience, the institution will eventually neutralize for you. And the institution, for its part, has done precisely that. Harry's reputation in the British press is in ruins. Meghan's is worse. Camilla, meanwhile, was crowned Queen Consort in May 2023 at Westminster Abbey, wearing a crown that had been quietly redesigned to carry her own story rather than anyone else's. The optics were not accidental. That history alone might be manageable. Royal families have survived worse. But what has changed recently is that Camilla's position inside the palace is no longer peripheral, and her influence over the king is no longer something anyone can afford to dismiss. She is not running a shadow court. She does not need to. The influence Camilla wields over Charles is not the product of manipulation. It is the product of 3 decades of proximity, shared temperament, and an understanding of the man that no one else in that palace comes close to matching. That is not not a romantic assessment. It is a structural one. Since the coronation in May 2023, the mechanics of that influence have become increasingly visible to those paying attention. Camilla has taken on a portfolio of patronages that reflects genuine interest rather than obligation. Literacy programs, domestic abuse charities, organizations that deal with the unglamorous edges of British life. These are not glamorous choices. They are strategic ones. They signal seriousness of purpose without threatening anyone. And they have worked. Her approval ratings, once a national embarrassment, now sit at levels that would have seemed delusional to predict 15 years ago. But the public face is only part of it. What matters more, and what the palace's inner circle reportedly understands acutely, is the access. Camilla is the last person Charles speaks to at the end of the day and the first whose counsel carries weight when the decisions are difficult. Aides who have worked across multiple royal households have described to various outlets a dynamic in which Charles increasingly uses Camilla as a sounding board, not just for personal matters, but for institutional ones. Who gets invited where, whose rehabilitation is considered viable, whose overture gets a response. She is not making unilateral decisions. She does not need to. Shaping the framing of a question is often more powerful than answering it. The question of the Sussexes is one she has shaped very carefully indeed. Harry's memoir was not simply a personal embarrassment for Charles. It implicated Camilla directly, describing her as dangerous, as a calculating presence pursuing her own agenda at the expense of his mother's legacy. Those were his words. They landed in millions of households. And while Camilla has said nothing publicly, sources with knowledge of the king's inner circle have consistently indicated that the book changed something, not just in Charles's relationship with his younger son, but in the atmosphere around any conversation about reconciliation. The wound is not Camilla's alone to carry, but she is the one who decides in quiet and in private how much weight it should still be given. That is where her power is most acute and most consequential. Not in the grand ceremonial moments, not in the redesigned crown or the carefully managed appearances, but in those conversations that never make it into any briefing document, in the counsel she offers when Charles is weighing something he finds genuinely painful. A son he loves, an institution he has spent his entire life preparing to protect. A decision about whether those two things can coexist with an olive branch extended toward people who publicly dismantled the family's credibility. And it is precisely that consolidated power that makes the reported possibility of a Harry and Meghan visit so charged, because for any meeting to happen, it would have to pass through Camilla first. Any meeting between Harry, Meghan, and the king does not simply happen. There is no casual phone call that resolves into a diary entry. What looks from the outside like a family reconciliation is, from the inside, a diplomatic operation, one with protocols, preconditions, and a chain of approval that runs straight through the Queen Consort. The logistics alone are formidable. A visit to Balmoral or Sandringham would require security coordination between the Royal Protection Command and whatever private arrangements the Sussexes now maintain. It would require agreement on press access or the deliberate absence of it. It would require a shared understanding of what the visit is, a private family moment, a formal audience, or something in between, because the distinction matters enormously to an institution that treats ambiguity as a liability. Every detail, down to which entrance the Sussexes use and whether any photographs are taken, carries symbolic weight that the palace machinery will need to process in advance. Then there is the diplomatic dimension. Since the publication of Spare in January 2023, the palace has operated on the assumption that anything said in Harry's presence is a potential future chapter. That is not paranoia. That is a lesson learned at considerable cost. Sources close to the household have described a climate in which even well-meaning senior staff are cautious about what they say when the Sussex question comes up. Not because they are hostile, but because the institutional memory of what happened last time remains vivid and unresolved. And underneath all of that sits the emotional architecture, which is the most load-bearing part of the whole structure. Charles wants his son. That much appears to be genuinely true, not performance. But wanting something and being willing to accept the conditions attached to it are two different calculations, and the conditions here are steep. Harry and Meghan have not retracted the claims made in the Netflix documentary, in Spare, or in the Oprah interview. No public acknowledgement of harm done to the institution has been offered. From Camilla's perspective, and she is not alone in this, an invitation extended without any of that addressed is not reconciliation. It is capitulation dressed up as generosity. What insiders describe in careful terms is a back-channel conversation that exists more in theory than in practice. There are people on both sides who speak to people on both sides. Messages are understood to have been passed, but the communication is neither direct nor warm, and the distance between a conveyed sentiment and a genuine negotiation remains considerable. One source characterized it as two camps that are aware of each other's temperature without being willing to sit in the same room to measure it. That is not progress. That is the management of a stalemate. Camilla's position, as it has been relayed through those channels, is not one of outright obstruction. It is something more strategic and, in its way, more difficult to navigate. A conditional openness that requires the Sussexes to move first, and to move in a direction they have shown no public appetite for moving. She is not slamming a door. She is leaving it ajar at a height Harry cannot quite reach. Yet even as those back-channel efforts quietly continue, a ruthless calculation is already being made inside the palace, and Harry and Meghan may not fully understand what they are walking into. The calculation being made inside Buckingham Palace is not emotional. It stopped being emotional some time ago. What senior advisors are now weighing, with the kind of cold precision that has always defined the institution at its most self-protective, is exposure. Specifically, who absorbs the damage if this goes wrong, and how much of it reaches the crown itself. A failed reconciliation, played out in even partial public view, would hand critics of the monarchy a gift they could spend for years. The image of a fractured royal family is not new. It has been the dominant story since 2020, but a visible attempt at repair that collapses, a visit that ends sourly, a meeting that leaks, a statement that satisfies no one, would be categorically worse than continued distance. Distance can be managed. A second rupture cannot. For Harry, the stakes are existential in a way that goes beyond any lingering affection for Balmoral or the houses of his childhood. His public identity in America has been built on a specific narrative, that he left because he had to, because the institution failed him, because the alternative was worse than exile. A reconciliation that appears forced, or that ends with him retreating again, destabilizes that entire account. It raises the question his critics have always wanted asked. Was it principle, or was it pique? Meghan's position is no more comfortable. Every concession that might be required, the quiet acknowledgement, the carefully worded statement, the appearance of goodwill toward people who have not offered it, runs directly against the posture she has maintained since Oprah. She cannot be seen to capitulate without it reading as capitulation. And inside the palace, there are people who would be perfectly content to let that reading stand. Then there is Camilla. Her legacy as queen is still being written, and she knows it. The modernizing consort who helped heal an ancient wound, or the gatekeeper who calcified it, that is the choice her handling of this moment will define. History has a long memory for exactly this kind of junction. She arrived at the crown carrying the weight of what she was once called, and she has spent years dismantling that reputation, carefully and without dramatic gesture. One miscalculation here undoes a significant portion of that work. No one in the story is playing for small stakes, which leaves the House of Windsor caught between two equally damaging outcomes, and the person holding the deciding vote is the woman who was never supposed to be queen at all. There is no clean resolution coming. That much is certain. The House of Windsor has survived abdications, divorces, and scandals that would have dismantled lesser institutions, but survival is not the same as reckoning. What this situation exposes, stripped of its diplomatic language and careful positioning, is something the family has never fully confronted. That the machinery built to protect the monarchy is now indistinguishable from the machinery that protects itself from accountability. Harry is not entirely right. The institution is not entirely wrong. And that ambiguity is precisely what makes this so corrosive. Clean villains are manageable. This is messier than that. Camilla holds influence she was never meant to hold. Charles carries wounds he has never publicly named, and somewhere between Montecito and Windsor, two people who were once at the center of everything are watching to see whether the door stays permanently closed. The monarchy's great unspoken bargain has always been this: silence in exchange for belonging. The question worth sitting with is whether that bargain was ever actually fair, or whether it was simply never refused by anyone with enough to lose. If this story made you think, subscribe to Regal Desk. There is always more happening behind these walls than the official version admits.